Well, good morning. Glad to see you. Does anybody need an outline today? Nobody? All right. Well, turn to 1 John chapter 4, please. 1 John chapter 4. So we're going to, today's the 18th, next Sunday's the 25th. The plan is we'll finish chapter 4 today, do chapter 5 next week, and then in September, Kevin's going to be back in here teaching, and we'll have our other class in the fellowship hall, and I've got some pretty interesting stuff we're going to be studying in there, so get back to what we had been doing before. 1 John chapter 4. And fairly brief outline, pretty straightforward stuff, but I think, and you've heard me talk about this, the importance of what we're getting ready to talk about, the manifestation of your Christianity is more than, you've heard me talk about this a lot, more than just coming to a church building. Verses 7 to 21 here, the love passage. And I point out that in 15 verses, the word love is used 22 times. And I have seen throughout the years where it's like there's this fear of talking too much about love because, and I've actually heard this, well, if you talk too much about love, people might think you're liberal. All right? I don't know what that means. I think I know what it means. That's all that some people might ever preach on or talk about. And that would present some problems because love is not the only thing that the Bible talks about. But to deny the importance of this subject and to overlook passages like this and to make practical applications of what does it mean to love one another, we're doing ourselves a great disservice. So that's what we're going to talk about today. J.B. Kaufman in his commentary said, John's repeated stress of such Christian love in this epistle might have been due to the fact, as opposed to McKnight, that's somebody else who wrote a commentary, that some of the Jewish converts, retaining their ancient prejudices, still considered it their duty to hate the heathen, even those who had accepted Christianity. And, doesn't Jesus talk about that in Matthew chapter 5? You've heard it said by those of old, to love your neighbor, but to hate your enemy. Well, I suppose that's a possibility that we're talking about here. I mean, there's nothing in the text that emphasizes that idea, but to overlook that possibility wouldn't be the best thing to do because, again, Jesus talked about it. Jesus talked about the fact that there were people in His day who hated their enemies. So, and that particular passage is towards the end. I'll just turn back there real quick and read a couple of things. It's towards the end of Matthew chapter 5. It begins in verse 43. You have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you. Well, why would you do that? Because verse 45 says, that ye may be the children of your Father who is in heaven. For He makes His sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends His rain on the just and the unjust. God is good to everybody. He is a good and loving God. Now that obviously doesn't mean He's not a God of justice and righteousness and holiness, but at the same time, He is a God of love and makes general provisions for everybody on earth. Even the most, think about it this way, the most militant atheist, if you could think of whoever might come to your mind, is blessed by God. He's living. He has all of these natural things, things in nature that God created that are provided for him by God. So I think what Kaufman said there, that's a possibility, because we do know that the Jewish converts to Christianity did have, I guess I would say, quite a bit of animosity towards non-Jewish converts. So anyway, so here we go. I've got 8 points here on love, and we'll talk about it a little bit, think about some practical application in some of these specific points. Love one another, verses 7, 11, 12, 17, and 21. All of those verses say that. And look particularly, if somebody would read verses 11 and 12. 1 John 4, 11 and 12.
Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love has been perfected in us.
How can that, what he says there in verse 11, we ought also to love one another, how might that be displayed? What are some practical ways that you can apply that command? Okay? Be kind to one another. Paul says that in Ephesians 4:32. Treat people with respect. Okay, if he stumbles, give him a hand up. And I'll tell you this one, and our culture struggles with this, and we don't need to allow this mentality to come into the church. Over in Luke 17, Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, rebuke him. Well, in our culture, that, to rebuke someone is not very loving. That's not kind, that's judgmental. You're going to push people away. But that's what Jesus says. If your brother sins against you, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. And that's a non-loving person won't do that. If I've wronged you and you know it and you won't come to me, maybe I do know it, and maybe I'm just being stubborn. Maybe I don't know it, because there are occasions where that happens. But whatever the case may be, I've offended you in some way and you don't come to me so that I can make that right. Are you loving? Are you being loving? If I do know it, that I've offended you, and I don't go to you, I'm not being very loving. But our world looks at confrontation as not nice and just, leave everybody alone, things like that. Well, that is a display of love to correct somebody. All right, any other thoughts on, again, practical application of what it means to love one another? Right. Right. Discipline is an act of love. Absolutely. Exactly. That's exactly right. And Hebrews 12 talks about that too. Beginning in about verse 5 down through verse 12. What son does a father not correct? God corrects us, we ought to correct our son, our children. So, yeah, absolutely. All right, anybody have any other practical application of what does it mean to love one another? Pray for one another, okay? What was the first word you said? Yeah, being honest. Absolutely. What good is it going to do to lie to somebody? Or to be lied to? That's not going to help anybody. Yeah. Yeah. Well, kind of with what Sarah said and what Reggie's saying, and if I'm in the wrong in something and you come and rebuke me for that, I should thank you. Because you cannot be right with God if you're not right with one another. And that's in Matthew chapter 5 as well, and Matthew chapter 18. We cannot be at odds with each other and right with God. So a loving response to a correction would be, I really appreciate that. I didn't know, or maybe I did know and I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. And then you just move on. You get past that and grow from that. All right, anybody have any other thoughts on that?
I just think about, you got to go out and teach the word. You show love towards other people,
There is I don't know if it's a TikTok or what it is, but there's this guy, I think his name is Penn Jillette, an atheist. And he's talking about that kind of thing where if you believe in, and it's him saying this as an atheist, if you believe in God and you believe in heaven and hell, and you don't come and talk to me about that, and you believe that I'm going to hell, what kind of a hateful person are you? How much do you hate me to not tell me, I may not believe it, but to not tell me that there is a God, there is a heaven, there is a hell? And that's something coming from a person from that perspective. How much do you hate me that you won't tell me about God? And I think, just kind of branching off from that idea, I think one of our causes of being hesitant is a fear of rejection. A fear of losing a friend, a fear of, strife within the family. We can come up with a lot of justifications for not doing that. Well, I don't want to rock the boat with this person. We're so close, we've been friends for so long, and I just hate to lose that person. Okay? So if you don't then take the step to talk to them, number one, who will? And number two, how are you going to explain that to them later? And what are you going to say to God about that? Because you're going to have to give an account. I thought that was an interesting... I'll see if I can find that, and I'll share it in our private group, because it's quite a thought. All right, so love one another. A multitude of ways that we can do that. Number two, love is from God. So you have the source of love, obviously, verses 7 and 8. Verse 7, Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. It's out of Him. He is the originator of this. And everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. Okay? Obviously, God loved us, verses 9, 10, 11, 16, and 19. And so, I tell you what, one of my favorite verses on that particular subject. Somebody turn over to Romans 5, please. And I want you to read 6 through 9. Romans 5, 6 through 9.
For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love towards us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved from wrath through Him.
Okay. Much more. Having been, past tense, justified, we shall be saved from wrath through Him. That's, when we think about the love of God, number 3 here, we typically think of John 3:16, and obviously that's perfectly fine. That's the golden text of the Bible, we say. But passages like Romans 5 and others really emphasize the action of God in that act. The action of God in that act. The love of God in that act. Number 4, love can be perfected. That's an interesting thought. Somebody read 1 John 4, verses 17 and 18, please. Well, but doesn't the Bible say, fear God and keep His commandments? Ecclesiastes 12? Well, we're not talking about a dread and a terror of God here. We're talking about, again, our manifestation of love towards Him, towards one another. And if we're doing that, if we're actively living that out as God did for us, and that's what He says there at the end of the middle of verse 17, we can have boldness in the day of judgment. Because we are acting like He acted. We're doing what God did. And so our love can grow, it can mature, become complete, perfected, as the King James says.
Did you exchange the word boldness there with confidence?
I would imagine so.
I just think about
Mm-hmm.
Try to simplify things for them. Would that be a word I could use there?
Paracia. Oh, that's interesting. So I've seen this word's used in other places, and it's the actual word is, one of the definitions is freedom of speech, unreserved in speech. You appear before God in judgment, and there's nothing to hide. You can have that assurance, confidence. I don't think there'd be anything wrong with using the word confidence, but
I just think today, Judge, like, if a person, maybe you think it was pretty bold for a person today to say, yeah, I'm going to heaven. Like, it's just so confident.
yeah.
Because he thinks he's doing everything exactly as the Bible instructs him to do.
Mm.
And you can do that. Like,
Yeah.
it's there for you to learn to read and to know. You can do that. I feel like bold is confident.
The third listed definition of that word there in verse 17 is fearless confidence. So, absolutely. Absolutely accurate. And that is interesting. It's like people at times are afraid to say that they are sure. You know, if you were to be pinned down, somebody comes up to you and pins you, are you going to heaven? Do you know you're going to heaven? What would your answer be? That's something to think about, isn't it? We can have boldness in the day of judgment, fearless confidence. And it's based on, because as He is, so are we in this world. We are living like God. We're doing what He would have us to do. And in this particular context, loving one another, loving Him, and living that out. Number 5, if you abide in love, you abide in God. So if you're not, and John talks about this back in chapter 3? Yeah, look at chapter 3 and verse 13. 1 John 3:13. Marvel not, my brethren, if the world hate you. We know that we have passed from death unto life because we love the brethren. He that loveth not his brother abideth in death. You don't love your brethren, you're spiritually dead. You do, then you have fellowship with God. And again, that shows the importance of us being right with one another, because if we're not right with God. And so we have to make every effort to, both of those things can be done at one time. Abide in love, abide in God. Love casts out fear, which we've already read that, verse 18. We love Him, verse 20. So we love Him, we love God. What is it that Jesus said about loving Him? How is that made manifest? If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Well, that's what He said to Peter. Yeah, in John 21, feed my sheep, yeah. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. John 14:15. And this was an easy way for me to remember it. The inverse, John 14:15, the inverse is John 15:14. It says, you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. Sure. Absolutely. Different definitions of love, yeah. And we use that word very loosely in our world. You know, there are things that we love. I love cold weather. But I love my wife, too. Now, those are two different types. And one of the interesting things is, too, when you study the New Testament, the Greeks actually had 4 words for love, 4 different Greek words for love. The most frequently used one in the New Testament is agape, and that's what we're looking at here. That's the word, God so loved the world. And that word doesn't necessarily involve emotions. It involves benevolence, it involves goodwill, good actions towards another. But then you also have Philadelphia, a brotherly love. You have storge, a familial love. And in fact, in Romans chapter 12, when Paul's talking about be kindly affectionate one towards another in brotherly love, he uses 2 of those words right there and combines them. Philostorgos, brotherly familial love. I think that's Romans 12, verses 9 and 10. So that's a good point. It is good to know that there are different words, and words mean things. we're acting in goodwill towards one another, benevolence towards one another, and we need to understand, again, how that can play itself out. And then number 8, He first loved us. And that kind of goes back to Romans, whoever read Romans 5 earlier. When we were still sinners, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. If you're worldly, and James says this in James chapter 4, if you're going to be friends with the world, you are at enmity with God. You're standing in opposition to Him if you're going to try to maintain the favor of the world and the favor of God at the same time. Can't be done. Any questions or comments on those little 8 points there? God loved us. Okay, so next, love is of God. And that word of, the Greek preposition is ek, and it means out of. So He is the original source. A man by the name of William Barclay wrote, "This is probably the single greatest statement about God in the whole Bible. It is amazing how many doors that single statement unlocks and how many questions it answers." I think I read that quote last week maybe, but no, I wouldn't have been last week. I wasn't here last week. But anyway, what that makes available to us, if we understand what that means, and here's the thing to think about, guys. Every right that God had to not do anything that He's done. As a perfect, holy, and just Creator, when He told Adam and Eve in the garden, "Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the day you eat thereof, you will surely die." Did He not have every right to end it right then with them and start over? Well, of course He did. But He didn't. And so that's something to think about. Like I said, how many doors that single statement unlocks and how many questions it answers. Man's love for God did not precede God's love for man. Guy Woods, only an ingrate would refuse to love Him in return. Boldness in the day of judgment. That's in your outline here. And we talked about that to an extent there in verses 17 and 18. There is, I guess, I don't know how to explain it. I've encountered it. I've thought about it myself, How in the world do you stand before God in judgment? Because when you think of, all right, so Forrest and I were talking earlier about the word confidence. What do you think of? Okay, so get an image in your mind of a person who's confident. What do they look like? How does a person present himself when he is a confident person? What? Okay, maybe, not meek. He can be perceived as arrogant. What else? If a person... Huh? Okay. Maybe somebody who's not afraid to speak his mind, stands up, shoulders back. And that can be perceived as pride, can be perceived as arrogance. But there's a difference between, because, the Bible also tells us, the same Bible that tells us we can be confident in judgment also tells us that pride goes before destruction. So there has to be some kind of line of demarcation between pride and arrogance and confidence and boldness. So while the Bible condemns one, obviously, in multiple ways, well, okay, so here's one. As I was thinking, the 2 men that went to the temple to pray. Would you call the guy who stood up and prayed thus with himself, I'm thankful, Lord, that I'm not this and this and this, and I do this, and I'm not like this. Would you call him confident or arrogant? You better call him arrogant. Because, and I've pointed this out to you many times, you remember what the text says about his prayer? He stood afar off and prayed thus with himself. It's one of those prayers, as we say, that didn't get any higher than the ceiling. That guy's arrogant. Now, what word might you use to describe the guy who was beating on his chest and asking God to be merciful to him? What word would you describe today to use to describe him today? Not confident. What? Humble, yeah. So humility and humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. James tells us that. And yet, confidence in the day of judgment. Somebody say something? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. You can be confident without, you can know things without letting everybody what you know. There's something to that. Right. Braggart, yeah. Absolutely. That's a good way, a great way to put it. Our confidence is not in ourselves, but in God, because He's revealed Himself to us. He's revealed what we need to be doing. And it's because of that that we can be bold. It's because of that we can enjoy that one of those definitions of that word back in verse 17 was the freedom of speech that we have with God. Yeah.
I think that whenever I think about it, it's you have confidence, you still have love for
Sure.
man. If you have arrogance, it's more about you. You're not really having shown love to that other person or whatever. So I think the difference between that pride and that arrogance and confidence is really love.
And that's a good way to put it. And that fits the context, doesn't it? Pride is love of self, love of one's own knowledge and abilities, and the other is more thoughtful. It's not all about me. Yeah.
Peter's a good example of both sides of that. When Peter thought about himself, I will not deny you.
Yeah.
When he said that, then he later takes out the sword and cuts off the ear. That's about Peter.
Right.
And that was arrogance. But then, when it was about Jesus, he stood up on the day of Pentecost and preached the sermon that we have recorded. And so what Ashley said, what Jerry said, put it all together, the source of our confidence, our faith, do we have faith in ourselves or do we have faith in
Yeah. That's an excellent illustration from the Bible. Look at Peter. Yeah, excellent.
Those two men praying that he's talking about, if he would have said something and said, thankful that I'm not like so-and-so, if he'd have said, thank you for all the blessings you've given me, and please help this poor soul that's struggling over here. Pray
Sure.
for him instead of basically praying against him.
Yeah.
It hadn't changed his wording very much. But he thought he was better than them.
If his heart, and this goes to something that Jesus taught. If that man in Luke 18's heart had been right, that's a good point. I'd never really thought about it like that. He could have, because this guy's over here, the text tells me, he's present tense, he's beating on his chest. He's begging God to forgive him. He could have prayed for him instead of saying, man, I'm glad I'm not like him. Yeah. That's a great example. And so in prayer, all right, in prayer, look at 1 John chapter 5, verse 14. This is a confidence that we have in Him. There's that word again. That if we ask anything according to His will, so that's qualified. Notice it doesn't just say that if we ask anything. If we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we desired of Him. That could have, Luke 18 could have played itself out a whole lot differently, couldn't it have? But there again is that confidence that we can have, that assurance, trust, conviction. But to me, that all goes back to verse 17, the end of 1 John 4:17. As He is, so are we. That goes back into 1 John chapter 3. what is it, verse 7? Yeah, 1 John 3:7. He that doeth righteousness is righteous, even as he is righteous. You can be like God. You can be faithful. You can know that your prayers are heard and answered. You can love one another properly. There's nothing, we don't, if we're living in line with God's will, we don't need to walk around as if we don't know what we're doing and we just hope we get to heaven one day. Just hope it all works out for the best. And live in a realm of wishful thinking. I guess maybe that's the best way to say it. There's the bell. Real quick, verses 20 and 21. If a man say, I love God, and hate his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment have we from him, that he who loveth God love his brother also. All right, 1 John 5 next week.